Our next presenter is Professor Cami, who is the director of the Cronyn Observatory. It's one of the historic campus observatories in Canada. And what he's done, I mean, he's an astrophysicist, which is what he normally does, works on buckyballs and things like that. But what he's done with this, he's taken an old installation and turned it into an effective instrument for education and public outreach. And that's what he's going to talk about today.
Do you want to hold it, or do you want it in there?
Well, in there, actually.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. It's always a true honor to speak for the Royal Amazing Society of Canada, right? And so I'm going to talk here. I was asked to talk about the Hume Cronyn Memorial Observatory, something that I kind of do in my free time, so to speak. But really what we've done, especially in the last few years, is changed how we use the observatory by actually changing things about the observatory. And pretty much everything we've done is done with just small amounts of money, but especially lots of love and passion, okay? And so is there anybody here that likes astronomy? Yeah, good. Anybody here that likes history? All right, good company here. So first I want to say that I am an amateur astronomer. And so my background is I grew up in Belgium, and so this is a map of Europe, and that's pretty much my childhood observing site. Okay, so it's not the best spot. This is my equipment. It's a 5-centimeter refracting telescope. It's the largest telescope that I have ever owned. I have ordered another one to actually arrive this fall. In the background, you also see my chemistry kit, and so not surprisingly, I ended up being somebody who's doing astrochemistry, right? So what I kind of was interested in when I was 5 years old, it's actually still what I'm interested in today, but that's not what I want to talk about. So this is the largest telescope that I ever owned. From Belgium, I moved around a bit to Portugal, the Netherlands, then to California. And in 2006, I moved from California to Western University. We moved in winter. It's the dumbest thing I've ever done. Not the moving to Canada, but the moving to in winter, I should say. And in any event, as I was there, the chair took me on a tour of the campus, and he showed me this small, little, quaint observatory that dates back to 1940. And inside is not a 5-centimeter refractor, but a 10-inch or 25.4 centimeter diameter refractor. And so he told me, like, well, you know, this place is not used very much. If you have any ideas, it's yours. So actually, perhaps this is actually the largest telescope I've ever owned. So there's a few more telescopes on there. So the large refractor here is a 10-inch with a focal length of well over 4.3 meters. There's also, not very well visible here, a 12-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain, and on the back side here is a 8-inch Schmidt camera. And so essentially, at that time in 2006, I thought like, so if I want to observe something, I can just come out here and use it. And so I've used it in my free time in the middle of the night to just look at stars and planets. At that time, how was the observatory used in 2006? Well, we had public nights every Saturday in July and August. So that means about 8 of these public nights a year. Typically, those would draw in about 600 visitors. And at about that time, one of my colleagues, Professor Campbell Brown, she had started a program called Exploring the Stars with a Promo Science grant. And essentially, that's active astronomy events during the evening on weekdays for youth groups, typically Boy Scouts and Girl Guides and that sort of things. If there would be special astronomical events, there would also be an event. For instance, here is the 1994 annular eclipse, and it's not really visible, but right here projected on the door is an image of the eclipsed sun. Nothing of very large scales necessarily. And so for the rest of the year, when I arrived in 2006, most of the observatory was used for something completely different. And in 96, the interior was remodeled. It was a little classroom built. And 3 times a day, the observatory was used for campus tours. So kids that possibly would come to Western would all gather there and then get a tour of campus. And so there were way more visitors that actually saw the observatory just as a starting point for the tours than people actually using it for astronomical observations. Now, if you ask me, any observatory that's not used, that's a waste of an observatory. That should, be illegal for some reason. And so as soon as I arrived at Western, started kind of being a little bit more active. And so the way the observatory worked at that point, there was one appointed coordinator for the observatory, and that was a different faculty member every year. And so that was not me in the beginning. And so whatever happened at Cronyn depended on the mood of that coordinator. So a few things happened, especially for the International Year of Astronomy. So some money was made available to get a new coat of paint on the inside, update our posters from the 60s and the 70s to be a bit more modern. And what was planned as a special IYA event is, instead of just doing our public nights in July and August, we would actually do them from May until August. Then in 2010, I became the coordinator for the first time, the first year. And so the first thing I decided, from now on, we're going to have public nights every Saturday from May to August every single year, not just for IYA. So that's the first thing that I wanted to change. Just you get more people if you have more events. And it's not that much more work to repeat an event that you already do before. The second thing I thought was starting to think about, what sort of changes should we make at the observatories? What sort of changes could we make? And so to kind of get some input from faculty, graduate students, postdocs, but also, and importantly so, from the local chapter of the RASC, I set up a small website that I called Friends of Cronyn. And essentially, it's a survey of everything that we have in terms of space, in terms of equipment, but also in terms of opportunities, in terms of manpower, that sort of things. And so this was kind of a vehicle where people could give me feedback on what they thought we could do. And so in the process, I also made a whole set of pictures of what does the observatory look like right now. And so essentially, it's all these things: space and equipment, some ideas for development, what sort of activities and people to run them can we come up with. What about time? And time, of course, is the most valuable commodity that we have. And it's also the one where if you have a large number of people that can help you out, you can actually collect a lot of time from people. And it's worth way more than any money you can ever get. Talking about money, if you've ever worked at a university, getting money for outreach, good luck in most places. Okay, so there's no big pots of money for outreach, and so actually for most of the time that I've been at Cronyn, I have run everything on a zero budget. Okay, so there was no option for large expenses. That has changed a little bit, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. And so, if you talk about money, of course, then there's lots of wisdom to be found in the observatory. And at that time, in the basement, I found these blackboards. And there's two pieces of wisdom written there. This one is the first one: Vini, Vidi, Visa. So if you have a corporate Visa card, that can help you a lot for money. Unfortunately, no such luck for me. And the other thing, if you get frustrated about finding money, the other piece of wisdom was this: in vino veritas, right? So once you've made a survey of what do you have and available, now the second part, and I think this is the most important part if you ever dream of some project, you kind of need to develop a vision. And a vision is not this kind of, you don't need big words to say like, this is what our vision is. No, you kind of need to have an idea of where you want to be at some perhaps undefined point in the future. And so by collecting all these ideas and thoughts of other people, in the end, what I wanted to do is be the year-round central astronomy hub for the greater London community, but then focus on the fun astronomy, not like any pure educational sort of activities, but actually fun things to do. What does that mean? Well, so first of all, you should have very good events for your visitors. Most of the events that we had the first few years that I was the coordinator were great if the skies were clear, because what beats looking at Jupiter or Saturn through a telescope, right? But of course, in our part of the country, most of the time, and especially in winter, the weather does not cooperate on your events. And so the only time that I had disappointed people at the observatory was when it's cloudy or rainy and there's nothing else to do, right? You can look at a telescope, but how interesting is that really, right? Just looking at the telescope. And so what I wanted to make sure of is that we had a rain plan, some activities that we could do even in case of bad weather, and also modernize the observatory a little bit, while at the same time, and this is one of these things that I got from this consultation from everybody who was involved, keep the historic feel of the observatory. And that's very clear. It's a 1940s observatory. Do not get don't replace a telescope by something big and modern and computerized. Keep the historic look and feel of the observatory. So that was the first kind of idea in terms of vision. The second thing was that I think we needed to use all the available space in the building. Up to then, actually, the only space that we used was upstairs, the dome at the telescope, and we have a little classroom where we could give presentations. The rest of the building we actually never used, and when I asked myself why not, nobody answered that question. It's because I was asking myself, I guess, but. So there were more rooms available, and I thought it's a waste to not use them. So let's make sure that we can use them. That means some repurposing and some remodeling throughout the building. And then the last part was we had a lot of events over the summer, but we had very few events actually over the fall and winter time. And so I wanted to have activities year-round, which then of course means that we also need to have more faculty, more graduate student RASC involvement, and we need to work on the sort of activities that we can do, because of course being outside is fun, but being outside at -34 for 3 hours stops being fun after a while, right? So when I say fun, this is one of the examples of what I mean. In the past, our observatory has been turned into all sorts of things, most notably around Halloween. The engineering students traditionally have done this prank where they turn it into a big jack-o'-lantern. Most of my predecessors would chase away the engineering students if they would have a chance. When they came to me asking if they could turn the building in R2D2, I looked very serious and let me think about it, but internally I was like, yes, let's do this. And they did. And it's those sort of things. You have to support all these things. It's this makes the observatory fun. This is fun for everybody, right? And so then it came to execution, and execution is always hampered by one and the same problem, and that is for a lot of things you actually do need money. Okay, and so the first thing I wanted to do in the observatory is actually get something like internet there and computers, because we had 0 computers, we had no internet. And I'm talking not about 1980 or 1990 here, I'm talking about 2012 at this point. Okay, there's no computers, there's no internet. And so to get an internet connection, that needs to be done by people in facilities management, costs $600. So where do you get $600, right? And so for each of these steps, it was like, okay, it costs $600, I'll find $600. So you knock on people's doors. Turns out a lot of my colleagues have research grants, and there's like fine print that says like, oh, you have to use $1,000 for outreach. Do they want to do the outreach? Well, not necessarily. I can help them, right? And so I tapped in those possibilities. There were some graduate students that were interested in writing applications for grants that they could get, but we couldn't get. And so in doing so, for instance, graduate students purchased a Coronado 90 millimeter solar telescope that we use now. There's small donations that we would get at events. And then the other thing that was an eye-opener is there are grants that are handed out for lab equipment and education. And so those we have used successfully for outreach. And so I think over the years, if you add all that up, I think we've collected close to $45,000 or something in grants. So that allows us to kind of build up a few things. For the rest, once you have your vision, the time scale of doing this, I think is not important. You do things step by step, and each step changes your building. And if you look back after a few years and you see how much that's changed, it's really, really impressive, I find. The number one event that changed everything is the 75th anniversary. So this is a picture of our observatory actually before it opened. So it opened on October 25, 1940. And so in 2015, we were going to celebrate our 75th anniversary. And so months beforehand, when I thought about like, yeah, 75th anniversary is kind of important, so we should do something. What I planned for was nothing large scale, because remember, I have essentially no money to organize anything anyway. And so all I planned for was a small outreach event at the date of the anniversary, nothing big, certainly no VIP type events and that sort of things. And so in the framework of like famous last words over the summer, I just said like, let's just clean out the basement rooms so we can use them for activities, and then, you know, let's see if we can do some historical overview at the time of the anniversary. And that started a lot of things. And so in the end, I did not just have a small outreach event. We did a thing the entire weekend. We had a VIP event and a reception where the president came to visit. We had all the RASC people over, of course, as well. And so a few things needed to happen. Here's our telescope actually shortly before our anniversary. Does that look to you like a festive telescope? No, no, no. It needs something. It needs a coat of paint. And of course, if the president of Western is going to visit the telescope needs to be in the Western purple, right? So we started painting it in the Western purple. This is Henry Leparskas. This is me. And so you clearly see that these fumes of the paint are toxic, right? And so here we are now with a nice purple paint telescope. We actually also painted the other ones black and the finder scopes in white. Looked a lot better. Then there's two people that at that point started playing a major role in our further developments. That's Henry Leparskas and Mark Tovey. So Henry Leparskas was a staff member in our department until he retired a few years ago. And he had an office at the Cronyn Observatory before the renovations in the 90s. So he's like, he has a lot of memories about how things were at the observatory. And Mark is an RASC member who also happened to be a historian. So what a fortunate coincidence. So Mark is as passionate about history as about astronomy, and Henry is as passionate about Cronyn as about astronomy. So kind of bringing all that together was great. And so downstairs we had like two big rooms that looked like this in 2015. This is what's called the black room. You can probably guess why. So the walls, the ceiling, and everything in this room is painted with a military-grade black paint. That's because it was used as a meteor lab for a while. But essentially it was deserted, full of junk. There's a doorway to this back room that for a long time had been used as an electronics workshop. This is how this electronic workshops looked like on the inside. So essentially it was, again, deserted and full of junk. But in between that junk, there's these tiny little kind of unusual old artifacts. And here's one, for instance, that's not easy to spot. Right there is the only frame, the only picture that we actually have of the dome of the Cronyn Observatory before it was actually lifted on the building. And so there's a lot of artifacts that we found in this room that were old, that looked old, and they were like, yeah, we should probably not throw these away, even though we're not quite sure what they are in a few cases. Then I also wanted to figure out how often has the Cronyn Observatory been used for astronomical research. So I started looking in the NASA ADS websites for papers about Cronyn Observatory that contain Cronyn Observatory. And in that I found a lot of articles in the Journal of the RASC. And at some point I saw a picture, an article with this picture in here. This is at a meeting of the RASC in 1952. And when I looked at this, like, there's a model of the Hale telescope right at the center. We found that while we were cleaning up. And there's this other thing right here that's called a sotalunium. We found that back too. And actually, I had been using that in my first year astronomy classes. Little did I know it dates back from 1938. It actually predates our observatory. And so we found a lot of things back, old artifacts. This then turned out that we had a room full of demonstration material. There's way more that we found in that room that was at some point at Cronyn, but then moved in the 90s when they were renovating the observatory. Mark, in the meantime, had gone to the archives, and so he found this picture in particular. And this is a gentleman called Colgrove sitting in the chair's office at the observatory. And so as we were cleaning up and we looked at this picture, we were like, oh, well, we have this desk and these chairs. We have this is a model for precession. So we could actually almost rebuild that room. So how about, this was Mark's idea, how about we actually try to rebuild that room the way it was in the 1940s? So instead of doing it upstairs where this picture was taken, we decided to do that downstairs. And so if you flip the image and you compare to what we turned that room into it, this is something that is so eye-catching to people who have never seen this before. You show this picture, you open the door, and then, of course, Mark was sitting there. He was actually wearing an 1940s top hat and everything at the same time. And so it's not just that we recreated this part of the image. In fact, the entire room is completely reinstalled in 1940 style. So this is what used to be this workshop room that was full of junk. All the junk has been cleaned out, and everything in this room is now from the 1940s. We included the original 1940s guest book that contains all the signature of anybody who ever meant something in terms of astronomy in the 1940s. So amongst others, Jesse Dunlap is in there, but also Hume Cronyn the Younger is in there, who became a famous actor. Richard Scott Perkin is there, who's the founder of Perkin-Elmer, that then they made our telescope, but later also would make the mirror for the Hubble Space Telescope. So they all signed on the first page of that guest book. And we added our own modern version of that guest book. The gentleman signing it here, by the way, is Barry Colgrove. He's the grandson of the gentleman Colgrove in the old 1940s picture. In the back here is something that may look like a meteorite to you, and that is because it is a meteorite. In fact, there's two things here. One is a meteorite, and the other is a plaster cast of the meteorite. So the actual meteorite is on the left. It's the Dresden Meteorite that fell in 1939 in Dresden, which is about 100 kilometers west of London. This is a plaster cast. There's a whole story about that meteorite, but it was observed from Western University, and that Colgrove gentleman actually wrote a poem about seeing that fireball. And the meteorite came to London, was a bit of a scam involved. With the help of London Life Insurance Company, we had the actual meteorite in the observatory for the first years at Cronyn. Then it was taken away, replaced by the plaster cast, but then London Life Insurance Company wanted to have the plaster cast back. And so I managed for the anniversary to get both the actual meteorites and the plaster cast side by side in that display case, but I had to guarantee proper security. Now, there is no good security in that building, or there was not good security in that building, so it meant I had to sleep in the observatory that night, which was great because there's a nice black room. So I had no idea when I woke up, is it day, is it night? Turns out it was day already. So of course I had to return these things, but before returning, I decided, like, let's pass by the engineers because they have this nice big 3D laser scanner. So we did a 3D laser scan, and then we obtained a 3D print, actual size. Only took 8 days of printing. Of course, nobody believes that a white rock is a meteorite. So some painting was involved, and so Henry started working. He actually worked with people that are experts in recognizing meteorites. It took him in total about 3 to 4 months to actually get everything right in terms of texture and paint colors and that sort of things. And so this is the final product. And so my test was, I took pictures of this meteorite, or this mock-up of the meteorite, to Peter Brown, my colleague, who's also an expert on meteorites. I asked him, like, hey, could this be a meteorite? And he looked at it like, yeah, that could be a meteorite. So like, okay, if it's good enough for him, it's good enough for anybody else. Okay, and so there's a lot of fallout from this thing. So originally, when we planned this historic, like, recreation of 1940s room, my idea was, like, and the display of all these artifacts that we found, my idea was, we're just going to do this for this weekend. Okay, it's the 75th anniversary. After that, we'll use those rooms for group events and activities. However, the reactions that we got on that historical room, because it combines history and astronomy at the same time, were so incredibly positive that we decided we're just going to keep this exhibit. And in fact, we decided there's actually a second period in the history of the observatory that was very active. That was the 60s. And so in the 60s, there was another observatory built 20 kilometers north of London, Elginfield Observatory. That was decommissioned in 2012, but it has a 1-meter telescope in there, and it has kind of this elongated room that's being used as the telescope control room. We had, right next to this 1940s period room, we had a bit of an elongated room, so we thought, like, hey, how about we just bring back that control room? And so this is a picture from the late 60s of that telescope control room at Elginfield. That's another view of the same room. And essentially, we took all that equipment from Elgin Field and we brought it back to Cronyn. So we have it all installed there, including like very cool Nixie tubes and that sort of things. This, by the way, is a picture. It's a poster you see, but this is an image of the telescope, and it's taken from the window at the telescope control room that's looking out to the telescope. What we're doing right now is we're making a transparency of that picture. We also brought back the window from the telescope control room. We'll mount it all in there and have like a backlit frame, so it'll be as if you're in the telescope room actually looking out at the telescope. We also have a TV in there where we actually show period-appropriate pictures of Elgin Field Observatory. And then this gentleman, Colgrove, he was the guy who built all these amazing models and demonstrations tools, and then he sold them to universities and astronomy groups. And so we had seen this picture in preparation of our anniversary. It's him in the observatory's workshop. But we had never thought about like where the workshop would actually be. Until one of our alumni came to visit us and pointed out like, hey, you guys, look at that workbench. That workbench has a very peculiar set of drawers. And if you look very carefully, there it is. So it was in the room used by the custodians to actually store all their stuff. But this is the original workbench from that picture. And so of course we thought like, well, it would be great if we can recreate the same sort of picture. And we got some help. So at the anniversary, we invited the grandson of this gentleman. So this is W.G. Colgrove. We invited his grandson and great-grandkids over. They brought a lot of artifacts. One of the fun moments of that anniversary, they came into our room. They saw this big Sotalunium, the 1938 model. They go, we have one just like that in our cabin. Right? So it's the only two that we know it still exists. But they brought a whole book handwritten by this gentleman where essentially he describes pretty much every day of his life, everything he did. One of the most amazing persons ever. He was a lithograph artist, then was hired as a botanist at the university, and then came to Cronyn, made all these astronomical tools. So we figured out a lot about our observatory just from going through that book. One of the things that I found in 2006 was a giant stitched panorama of the moon. And when I asked our emirate, like, what's the background? Was this like a student project or something? They're like, well, I don't know. Turns out that on a rainy Sunday afternoon, W.G. Colgrove had nothing else to do, so he took all these pictures from the Lick Observatory and turned them into this giant moon mosaic. So that too is from the 1940s. So we decided, well, let's do an official opening of our new exhibit and invite the grandson again, Barry Colgrove. And so here's the grandson of Colgrove, essentially in exactly the same place, recreating the original picture. And so it's all those things which if you see it, it's kind of cute to look at, but to see it in person is even better. The black room that I showed you, we decided to not keep open for historical demos, but I certainly want to have a room where we can bring groups in and do demonstrations. And in terms of financing, we didn't have a lot of money, as I mentioned before, but we do have some manpower. And at some point, one of the graduate students needed to be a teaching assistant. It was established that his technical skills were more developed than his skills of being around children, let's say. And so I was like, great, let's do a technical project. And so I essentially told them, like, you have no money, but can you build me something that demonstrates how we detect planets around other stars, like an exoplanet demo tool? And so sure enough, he did. It was not for zero money. It was for $168 in total. But essentially what it is this, there's a light in here. So you turn it on, there's a light. And there's a lazy Susan that goes around with these planets that move in front of this light. And here, this is our model of the Kepler Space Telescope, essentially just a photometer that's connected to a computer. And so on the screen, you see live measurements of the brightness of this light. And as this planet moves around, you see these characteristic transit curves. And so it's a very cool demonstration of transits. And then the other demo that I wanted to have is spectroscopy. And so we have all these diffraction glasses, fairly cheap to get. You can show with this LED RGB tower, you can show that white light is made up of all possible colors. And then we have hydrogen, helium, mercury, and neon lights that allows you to really see all the spectral lines for each of these elements. So you can really drive home how you can detect all sorts of chemicals at great distances. The best way to drive this home, and this is something that I wanted to do for a very long time, and finally last month I managed to do this. If you think about light, spectroscopy, and chemicals, the first thing that comes to light is fireworks. This year is the International Year of the Periodic Table. So on a big event called Science Rendezvous, I finally managed to give my audience diffraction glasses and shoot a fireworks show up. And this is how it looks like. If you have very good and fast eyes, you can actually recognize the spectra of sodium, of barium, and of strontium. And if you were at the festival, you actually got to see that really well, I should say. I don't want to show everything. Okay, we've done a couple of other things as well. Part of what we did in terms of the spacing required that we also need to store things. There's things that we want to keep. We don't necessarily want to display them right now, but we also don't want to throw them away. So we need to do some renovations for storage room and our eyepiece room. Those were actually fairly cheap. It's all IKEA-based stuff. For the eyepiece room, it was donated, and actually this year I got money for more renovations at Cronyn. And so that has completely changed how we used our observatory. In the past, we just did stargazing occasionally with maybe a presentation. Now on a typical public night, we do have still our presentation. We do tours of the building. We have these astronomical demonstrations. We do visits of these spirit rooms, hands-on activities, stargazing, and themed activities or pop-up exhibits. And so you see that stargazing is just one thing that we do in the observatory, and so you can actually have groups over, and even on rainy days, it's a fun-filled evening. Funding is still a little bit of an issue, but we found a few ways around, and the one thing that I started 2 years ago is private paid events. I will never say this to the university, but I kind of jokingly call them like me being an astronomy gigolo, right? Because people pay me money to spend time with me, right? At the observatory, so to speak. And I would never think that people would actually pay money to do this, but they do, and it's good money. We got some money from the university, but because these historical aspects, we also now get funding from the Cultural Heritage Council, amongst others. And we have institutionalized donations. That's the one big breakthrough I had with the university, that we can now finally accept donations. And so in terms of numbers, I actually just compiled the 2018 numbers. So in total, we did 30 public nights, getting about a bit less than 2,500 visitors. 34 of these Exploring the Stars events for youth groups. We did 5 special events. This is Observe the Moon Night, Science Literacy Week, that sort of things. 24 private events. These are these paid events or private group events. 15 course projects, and so if you add it up in 2018, we had about 4,783 visitors in 108 events. Those numbers are slightly down from 2017, actually. And of course, in 2017, we had some other events here, just a few pictures of our outreach events. 2012, we had the Transit of Venus, where we had about between 2,000 and 2,500 people. The lunar eclipse in 2015, we had about 1,000 people. But then the solar eclipse in 2017 in August, that was massive. We had about 7,000 people show up on campus just on that one day. And finally, I want to end. We are still developing a couple of things, and so we're always searching for missing pieces. And for instance, in this picture, there is a peculiar type of a reflecting telescope. We're not quite sure what kind of telescope that really is and where we could find one like that to make our exhibit complete. Similarly, if you're more, say, like a 60s type person, these things we're also missing. This is a PDP-11 piece that we don't have. This is a Hammerlund device, and then there's a real tape device. If you have any of those lying around at home, by all means, let us know. We will give them a good spot forever. And so with that, I want to conclude. If you're in London or the surroundings, by all means, come on by and have a look. It looks a lot better in person than it looks on slide. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that. And you get a magnetar. Well, a picture of a magnetar.